episode of Elephant Den. It's Ashley.
And Alex.
And on this episode, we're going to be discussing the film dun, 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 dun.
2001 Space Odyssey. The film is written and directed by Stanley Kubrick. The film is 55 years old.
Released 1968.
One of, if not the pinnacle science fiction movies created that inspired so many works to come after. And we have a lot to talk about, so we'll jump right into it.
Before we get into it, I just want to mention, if you've been enjoying our videos, please click the subscribe button down below, click the notifications. All right, with that, let's get started.
So, as we introduced, it really is the pioneer of great science fiction films that came after. We're going to talk about what an influence it had on pop culture and audiences. Stanley Kubrick at the time teamed up with science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, and working together, they both wrote the screenplay while Arthur C. Clarke was writing the novel. So simultaneously, they were doing. He was working on both with Stanley on the screenplay for the film and
that's pretty
for his
cool
own novel.
Because you could be like writing this book, and then at the same time you have someone there making the visuals.
And we'll talk about a few things that they changed. But yeah, so 1968, kind of this goes along with our Oscar, getting closer to the Oscars. This film was nominated for a few things, like Best Director for Stanley Kubrick, Best Writing, and Art Direction. However, it only won for the fourth nomination, which was Best Effects for Stanley Kubrick.
So it only won one award, eh?
Yes, one Academy Award. At the time of its release, it had mixed reviews from audiences and critics.
Well, I can imagine this film coming out like at that time, 1968. It's so different, right? So it causes a lot of. It's one of those films that people are going to talk about afterwards because it's so out there.
This was my second time watching it, your first time. What was your first overall impression, without getting into the ending specifically? Just what was your overall emotional response to the film?
So I think I had high expectations going into it because a lot of people have talked about this film. It was something that everyone referred to because I'm a fan of Interstellar, and partly the reason because it's a film that's bigger than human life. And so when I tell people that, they're always like, oh, you should watch 2001 Space Odyssey. And so, yeah, I always had this kind of expectation of it, knowing that it was more of an abstract film.
Mm-hmm.
So when I watching it, I was obviously like, first impression, it was great. It was more so a frustration internally for me because I couldn't understand it right off the bat. After finishing it, I was like, oh God, I had too many questions. It made me feel like I was not the smartest because I couldn't understand it right away. You know, it kind of like, there was a frustration in me that I was like, how come I don't get it?
It's, I think, of any of the great films, to me, it's one of the most personal, the one that you bring the most to as a viewer. And over the years, my relationship with the film has evolved, but I think that first response is in many ways, I think, the truest response to 2001. I think it is primarily an emotional experience. It's something you feel.
The author and Stanley Kubrick, so they wrote the screenplay together, they both, for a long time, Kubrick especially didn't like to explain that kind of the ambiguousness of the ending and what it all meant.
Partly because he was like, if I were to explain it to you, it would sound stupid.
Yes. and Clark said if audiences got it off the bat or the first watch, then they wouldn't have succeeded in what they were going for. So in that way, your response is what they wanted. And not to finish your thought for you, but I just also wanted to mention how it seemed, which I could agree with, is this movie lacks a human connection in a way, where Interstellar was very emotional, and it really brought, like, the core theme of that film
Was family.
was family and love. This film doesn't touch on that. In fact, you don't get a lot of access to these characters,
There's not enough depth in relating and sympathizing for the characters in the film.
which is purposeful, but I could see how that could be a problem to a lot of audiences. James Cameron said the same thing, where he loves the film and he watched it, I think, over a dozen times in its theatrical run. However, and I'm quoting him, he said the movie lacked emotional balls.
Which I agree with him on that.
So this film is more or less broken up into different chapters, and it starts with the dawn of man, where the first 20 or 25 minutes of the film is nonverbal. You're just watching, this is like the Stone Age, where we're following a tribe of apes, and immediately we're seeing acting of human actors in monkey suits, and I thought that was really, really cool to see for its time. And you obviously think of some other films that do it differently or similarly, right?
I'd like to touch on the acting aspect of the
Yeah, why don't you say your part for that?
So watching it, I mean, I was trying to also understand this from the perspective of 1968 and the time period where obviously the CGI wasn't it wasn't done at that time, and
This movie was all in camera practical effects. There was no computer generated.
exactly. So with that in mind, obviously they've done a phenomenal job with the costumes, the sets, and even I thought it was so cool the mouths of the apes, how they would move.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how they were programming that. But there were things that did take me away, because I found the apes to be too human-like. There was something in the acting that bothered me, where it was like little things, like you could tell that these apes were humans in ape costumes, but like
Can I mention the name? Sorry for interrupting, but
worries.
the mime who worked as the main ape choreographer and he was training all the other humans to act as apes was Daniel Richter, who was a mime. And I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. And I'm not trash talking his work,
It's
because
okay.
I think it's amazing still.
Look,
Unbelievable
there's
job.
things which you point out, which I totally agree with. Look, even the costume, you see the human eyes behind the costume. But you mentioned things about the movement and how they were placing
Like their arms, I found their arms to be too stiff. Their walking, the way they were walking or standing was too human-like, the hands, particularly for me, I was watching that. Monkeys rarely stretch their hands out like this. I think that's a human movement. But so when he goes to touch the black box,
the monolith.
the main ape,
Yeah.
he touches it in the way a human would touch it, rather than in a monkey touching it with bent hands.
Yeah.
So it was just like little things like that I was kind of like, ooh, like, I mean, for a director that pays attention to detail, I think I would have liked it a little bit more, paid attention to those little details.
And I'm sure you agree, overall it's pretty great. It's okay to be devil's advocate.
So
and
good.
That's why it's super interesting to compare it to other films, like the ones I thought of more recent years. For example, 2017, The Square. It's a Swedish film where Terry Notary, I showed Ashley this clip, but there's this contemporary art scene in a dining room with 100 people, and this man, not in a costume, just he's actually shirtless, and he has little stilts to give him more of the ape posture, but he acts as an ape.
I think it was important for the director in that film, The Square, to find someone who had the body posture to walk like an ape, because that really did make it more believable. If you had a person that had like very broad shoulders that were straight, it like would take away from that. It's like little details like that that I pay attention to.
Yeah.
So then when I'm watching the scene in The Square, like it like helped so well with the arms being more flimsy and not so straight. So that's what I mean in terms of like the difference between the apes in Space Odyssey and then this man who played an ape.
Yeah. So there was one film, The Square, the Planet of the Apes films. There you have great costume and makeup, but those apes are meant to be as human-like. They're more civilized than humans on that planet.
Right.
And that's interesting in its own way and terrifying, but also kind of cheesy with their accents and the acting in that movie. Back to 2001, the makeup artist Stuart Freeborn, he didn't receive an Oscar nomination. And there's the legend out there that supposedly, for the time and for what audiences have seen by that point, it was so believable that they just thought it was real and they didn't even consider there to be
They were actors.
any extra good makeup or anything like that, which is just a legend. Who knows?
That's interesting.
So we're viewing the civilization of apes, and one day they wake up to this black monolith artifact structure appear before them, and they touch it, and it's from that point on that their intelligence develops, and they evolve to use tools and even commit murder. You have that amazing shot, that transition shot of the ape throwing up the tool, the bone, and it cuts.
That he just killed.
That he just committed murder with, and it cuts to a similar shape but a spaceship. That's one of the greatest
I think
transition shots in
it was a
film
really
history.
It was a really cool transition shot because, like, just going from that time period, how much space and time had happened from that moment of the bone to the transition of the space shuttle.
It's
like
it's amazing.
evolution in one shot.
And they work with the narrative of the story, because then we do jump ahead to a future of man where we're doing space travel. And so we're going to talk about the Lunar Jupiter mission segment, where there's a lot of great world building
Yeah.
and set designs, which were supposedly worked on by NASA experts, helped design the sets.
Which makes sense because watching it, I was like, this is so intricate for this time period.
And again, it's all in camera practical effects. They're using miniatures, which Kubrick even had destroyed because they were such intricate, detailed miniatures. Oh, wow. Miniatures, which were really bigatures, right? Some of them were the size of a room. But he had them destroyed all for except one. The one that they kept and they sold was the lunar lander Ares. And it sold for $340,000 to a private buyer. Well, at that time, that's still a huge amount of money for a prop. And it was sold to a private buyer and now is in a museum.
That's really cool.
As far as inspirations, you know, they have the rotating set that they built. That cost them $750,000 to do the, you know, the run around. It's like a Ferris wheel they built. And it reminds you of Christopher Nolan. In Inception, he built the hallway. You have to think that was part of his inspiration because that's never done.
No,
those
exactly.
Kind of sets, rotating sets.
As someone who's just watching this film for the first time in 2022, it's really cool to look back at all the films that were created afterwards and see how a lot of the ideas were taken from this film, right? Like he created that This is like the OG
The
of space
OG.
films.
You forget now as a, modern day, we're talking 55 years later and everything's come out since then, Star Wars, Dune. But we were watching this film and I realized, oh my gosh, like even the hangar in this film clearly inspired Star Wars, or the interior of some of these ships clearly inspired Ridley Scott for Alien. And they'll be the first to tell you. Ridley Scott even said how for Blade Runner, when he wanted to get the replicants' glowing eyes in shots, he referred back to this film where Stanley Kubrick got the shot of the Jaguar's glowing eyes. And he asked him, how do you do that? And it was something about a light splitter and a 45-degree mirror and or glass and all these things. And I don't know the exact science of it, but it's amazing.
Amazing.
But yeah, huge movies like that were inspired.
I do want to mention the clothing for set design. I just found it interesting that if this was something that takes place way in the future where we have space travel, why didn't our fashion change? Because there's a scene when they're sitting down drinking and talking, and
Yeah.
there's a coffee bar right behind, where I mentioned yesterday how in the future are we going to have a coffee bar, or is there going to be something, a drink that we drink that gives us energy and caffeine that's not called coffee, Like, I wonder if those things would change in the future. If you could make a film about the future, why not change it a little bit?
Right. So there's little things like that, which I noticed too. But then it's amazing. They're using iPads.
Yeah, that was really
50
cool.
years before iPads
While
ever
they're
came out.
eating, and that was really cool.
Or you have one of the only, well, I think it's the only purposeful joke in the film is the moment before he uses the anti-gravity toilet and he has to read this huge list of instructions. I thought that was hilarious.
That was funny. I liked the scene where the steward is grabbing the tray for food, but she's in the same hallway and she's on the same platform, but she walks in a circle to go to the next room.
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, to close it off with just the world building and the sets, I loved the ships they created, even like the little mechanical movements, right? It was so well done, detailed. It made me think of the recent Dune film and how that kind of, that was more in computer effects, and they try and do it, but it's nowhere even close to the quality and the amount that this film does it.
Well, that's why it's so phenomenal to think that this film was done in a time when they didn't have this much technology to make space travel, spaceships look so detailed and well done. Like how it blows my mind
And
how
the
well done it was.
cinematography they're pulling off at the same time, or even the angles are so kind of like they do some weird angles sometimes. They use fish lens just to like kind of show the confusion, or like the no, in the anti-gravity environment there's no real up or down. It's just, and they'll use purposely like really weird angles, and I love that.
Despite your enormous intellect, are you ever frustrated by your dependence on people?
As we jump from one chapter to the next, the only real connection is this monolith structure, which is now on the moon, discovered by man, and they're trying to figure out who buried it there. And that's like, there's this talk of discovering an alien or entities, or like some higher knowledge, which is kind of kept a mystery. But that's really the only through line of the film. And so suddenly we're just following these astronauts who are on their way to Jupiter. In the novel that was being written, it was Saturn, but Kubrick couldn't recreate Saturn's rings with effects, so they've changed it to Jupiter. And at this point, we're introduced to the AI, the other crew member, which is an AI, HAL 9000. He sabotages the whole mission. Well, he sabotages the group to protect the mission and eventually to try and save himself. And it creates for some of the most high tension sequences in the film. First,
Haunting.
very haunting, where he first commits murder, right? He snips one of the crew members off his line, and Dave
Or he
has
just
to,
turns off the machines that he can
and he
has
turns off
access
the
to.
he turns off the life support for the crew and sleep.
Well, his whole plan was to set up this problem
Yes.
on one of the satellites.
And then David and Frank try and find a space where they could talk without Hal hearing, but Hal still has view of them and can read their lips.
Which is so well done that they did that last shot of just no audio, but just their mouths moving.
It's such an important, huge theme of artificial intelligence, how it wants to preserve its life.
Just like us humans.
Just like us humans. And, eventually when Dave gets back inside and he's able to get control of the situation, he starts to lobotomize or shut down Hal. And it's a great sequence. It's all silent. There's no music.
I'd like to say that's the best part in the entire film. The most.
Maybe a lot of people would agree with you.
Yeah. Just the slow process of killing AI.
Stop, Dave.
It's just so well done
eerie.
that there was no, because when humans are in distress,
We shout.
we
think that will make a
our
difference.
levels of our voice changes. But then when you have an AI who's fighting for their life, there's none of that. It's just a constant repetition of stop, Dave, stop.
And I thought what was really the best part of that is when he realizes he's being shut down, he regresses back to his birth.
Daisy, give me your answer too.
He recites Daisy,
song Daisy.
the song Daisy, which was one of the first real-life experiments for voice synthesis done by an IBM computer. And so the author was such a nerd that he thought you have to
Put that in
you
there.
have to put that in there. Yeah, it's so eerie.
Oh,
And
it's so eerie. And they did it in like a low, because his voice was going back to
Yeah.
that. Oh, so well done.
yeah.
That's, I think, the start of AI being this enemy that can almost be inevitable to get rid of, you know?
Well, and
Like, that's the start of AI being terrifying.
and lots of modern scientists and theorists are concerned that the Third World War won't be a nuclear war. It'll be machines. It'll be artificial intelligence sabotaging the world,
right.
humans, and makes you think of Terminator.
Another point on that is even when the astronauts talk about HAL 9000 having emotions, they refer to him as having emotions, but
They're
whether
like-
or not they're real,
They can't know
no
for sure.
one ever knows that.
It's just the fact that he has a normal tone voice and the way he refers to himself. And let's talk about the score, because so originally Kubrick they offered Pink Floyd the opportunity to score the film, and they
He
declined.
missed out.
And Roger Waters, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, he says that's one of the biggest regrets of their career. And they even made tracks afterwards that kind of like Echoes, I think, is a track, or which kind of may tie into what they would have done. But so Kubrick decided to use a lot of classical compositions, and during most, if not all, of the speaking scenes, there's no music. It's in the intro, the intermission, and in the end. I want to point out György Ligeti, who's a Hungarian musical composer,
Shout out.
who they used a lot of his work, most notably from his compositions Atmospheres and Requiem. The opening, before we see any visuals, it's a black screen, and we get his composition of Atmosphere, which is really kind of mysterious, almost sinister, but you think of like the unknown as far as alien life and the question of human evolution. It's all there in this musical composition.
It must have been a great cinematic experience as well, sitting in that theater, pitch black,
Yes, I agree.
listening to that.
Fantastic. You also have during the lunar mission when the astronauts are approaching the monolith, you have his Requiem composition, which is also very, that's where you get all those voices, and it just seems like it's the end of the world, and it's something so bad, but they don't know exactly what it is that they're approaching.
It gave that feeling of
It was dread,
something
but
so unknown.
so unknown. Not even evil, just unknown.
Unknown.
And the monolith throughout the movie, there's no clear explanation to what it is, but we're made to believe it's an artifact of like a godlike artifact of pure intelligence, which maybe aids to the help of human evolution. I love how the monolith, they use the sound design. It emits a sound like a computer modem, which is the first internet sign-on? Question mark? I thought that was a great choice. Then you also have the atmosphere score continue during the intermission after we find out Hal has read their lips, and you're just like kind of taken aback by that.
Chills.
But most notably, I think, is the Stargate sequence where after Dave shuts down Hal and he goes through space travel, you get the atmosphere score again. And this sequence was responsible for why a lot of young audiences, went back and watched the film on psychedelics and that sort of thing.
I could see that.
And it's what gave it much greater reception in the box office as far as money. So the score, I thought was fantastic, and I was proud to hear it was a Hungarian who had a huge impact, had a big part of the
that's
score.
pretty amazing. To touch on that, I did want to talk about the sounds, how with moments with how the silence was eerie. It's like this film didn't need to put a soundtrack over certain scenes because the silence and the sounds of heavy breathing, like natural noises happening in that moment is enough. And so it made me realize how important sound is in film. I mean, I know that because Kevin tells me all the time.
Yeah.
But like just emphasizing that really makes a huge difference in human emotion while watching.
Sound design, yes, and when not to use music.
Yeah, exactly.
When something is so powerful and
in the message,
it doesn't need to be manipulated with music.
No.
And this movie, when it has these big epic compositions, it uses it. But then when it needs to be quiet, it really relishes in that silence. We come to like the big ambiguous ending where Dave is he discovers himself in a room that is,
it makes no sense.
well, it's my dad pointed this out, and the filmmaker as well, where it's designed as a simulation so what the idea is that some advanced being or intelligence has placed Dave in this zoo. And just like in our zoos on Earth, we try and simulate an ecosystem which an animal we think would like. However, that is probably very inaccurate. And so you have this room, this set that's, the design, from the furniture to the moldings, the art, it's all inaccurate. And time seems to just, as we experience it in the film as well, we have no concept of time, and neither does Dave, and he grows old there. while being observed by these higher beings, and eventually he's becomes a star child, and what Kubrick describes as like a Superman, if you will,
Coming down to earth.
and the question is, beyond the film, is what happens when he comes in contact with Earth.
Who does he become? Is he Jesus?
Yes. So that concept of him becoming this higher being is reflective of so many religions and storytelling from all different kinds of nations, if you will.
Even though my first impression of the film was, what am I feeling? All these questions I don't understand. I'm frustrated. In the end, you understand this film as open-ended. And it's also kind of a simple idea, if you think about it. It's just like the evolution of humans and the possibility of there being a higher intelligence that we don't know, right? But it just leaves it so open-ended, just like our understanding of all of this being so open-ended, that anything is possible.
I find it hilarious how modern directors who saw the film at its release were, you know, in their theater experiences, they had audiences who were, you know, stood up and announced, "That's God" on the screen, or they made a hole and ran into the screen because they were just so, they were having a religious experience, those particular people. But then, in the premiere, for example, 241 audience members walked out because they were just, can someone please explain to me what this
They
film
couldn't
is?
understand it.
Yeah, over time it's talked about, and it's, I loved now having some idea of what came after it and seeing how this must have influenced it.
Inspired so many people.
I hold it to such a high regard, and it really is this epic journey, this odyssey of man's evolution, and through not just the one character, but these different chapters and parts of human evolution. And I think from its technical achievements to the big themes it showcases, I really love this film.
You can tell Stanley Kubrick was obsessed.
Yeah, I mean,
The detail, everything.
Obsessed is the right word, and with all respect, a little nuts. And it's that obsession which could only that obsession can make a film like this.
Genius.
Okay, well, that does it for today's episode.
Thank you so much again for watching. As always, we always appreciate your views, your likes, your comments. Hit the subscribe button if you really enjoyed this video and you're looking forward to more. Tell your friends about us. Follow us on Instagram. Our account is called @AshleyandAlex for more updates and info. And follow us on Letterboxd, which will attach our usernames down below.
We'll catch you next time. Thanks so much.
You're awesome.